The restaurant opened before sunrise, and so did Maya's exhaustion. Alabaster Row was the kind of place built for people who never had to check a price tag. Tall ivory pillars, imported crystal chandeliers, and a piano that played itself in soft, elegant waves. Every morning, Maya slipped into its opulence like an outsider trespassing on forbidden ground. Her black apron tied tightly around her waist, a pen tucked behind her ear, she moved through the dining room with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to disappear while noticing everything. She had survived years of barely scraping by, of navigating a younger brother's needs, landlord's impatience, and life's constant sting. Maya's eyes, sharp and calculating, rarely missed a detail. A napkin slightly askew, a silver fork dulled at the tip, a customer's hesitant glance toward the wine list. They all told a story she could read. But she never expected to read someone like Alexander Hale. Alexander sat alone in a corner booth, the early sun bouncing off the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing him in a golden halo that seemed almost cruel in its beauty. He was impossibly tall, impossibly composed, and exuded wealth with such ease it was as though the world had been designed entirely for him. But the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor of his hands as he reviewed the documents on the table, betrayed a man on the verge of collapse. Bankruptcy loomed over him like a silent predator, and he had no one to blame but himself, or so he thought. He flipped the papers with a mechanical precision, eyes scanning numbers, dates, and signatures, but not really seeing them. His mind replayed every boardroom failure, every financial misstep, every prideful decision that had brought him here. Alexander had spent a lifetime believing that control equaled safety, that admitting weakness was surrender. Yet here he was, on the brink of losing it all. Maya noticed him instantly, the way he held himself, the subtle tension in his posture, the silent aura of panic he tried to hide behind impeccable tailoring. Something about him seemed fragile, though no one would dare call him so aloud. Most customers were dismissive, impatient, or entitled, and she had learned to shield herself from each. But today, her instincts whispered that he was different, that beneath the sheen of wealth, he was just as human as she was. As she approached his table, she noticed the small details that told a story no one else had the patience to read. A misaligned signature line, a footnote missing an essential number, the slight smudge of ink that could invalidate everything. Her heart skipped, not from fear, but from the instinctual urge to help. She knew what it meant to miss something crucial, to pay a high price for oversight. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, leaning slightly so he could hear over the quiet hum of early morning staff preparations. "I think there's a small error in these documents. I don't mean to intrude, but—" Alexander's eyes snapped up, sharp and guarded. "I'm not sure that's any of your concern," he said, voice steady, almost cold. It wasn't rudeness so much as the defensive armor of a man who had learned to guard against the world. Maya's stomach tightened. She had faced dismissals before, derision for being young, poor, and just a waitress. But something about his sharp gaze, the underlying exhaustion behind it, made her hesitate. Yet she couldn't look away. "I promise it's minor, but it could make a big difference," she pressed, placing her finger gently on the line she had noticed. He frowned, leaning over the papers, and for a moment something in his eyes softened. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the faint recognition of a kindred awareness, someone who noticed the details that could save or ruin a life. But just as quickly, the mask returned. He straightened, brushing past the hint of vulnerability. "Are you certain? I can't afford mistakes," he said, almost to himself. "I'm certain," she said, firm but calm. There was courage in her voice she hadn't known she possessed until that moment, and she felt the unexpected thrill of being seen, not for what she lacked, but for what she could offer. The restaurant continued its quiet awakening around them. The chandeliers reflected in polished silverware. The piano played, almost imperceptibly. Outside, the city was stretching awake, indifferent to the small drama unfolding inside a corner booth. Yet inside that golden-lit space, two lives brushed against each other, tentative, fragile, and profoundly significant. Maya backed away when he looked up, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something softer, though he quickly masked it. Alexander's pride, honed over decades, bristled at the thought of needing help from anyone, let alone a young waitress, and yet in a single glance he realized that she might have just saved him from the consequences of one tiny, disastrous oversight. Meanwhile, Maya felt a stir of emotions she hadn't anticipated. He was intimidating, yes, and undeniably proud, but he was also human, vulnerable in ways that wealth had never protected him from. The collision of their worlds was inevitable, and she knew that once the truth of this morning settled, neither of them would leave unchanged. Across the room, a tray of silver coffee pots rattled softly, the steam rising in thin, curling lines. Alexander sat back, exhaling as he considered the implications of her words. He hated admitting reliance on anyone, but Maya's quiet confidence, her attentive eyes, reminded him that sometimes the smallest kindness could prevent ruin. And Maya, adjusting her apron, felt something shift inside her, a flutter of purpose, the whisper of possibility. Perhaps the day wouldn't just be another series of orders, complaints, and endless running. Perhaps for the first time in a long time, someone needed her insight, and perhaps she was exactly what they didn't know they needed. The collision was subtle, almost imperceptible, but its impact would ripple through both their lives. Alexander, the man who believed in control above all, would be forced to confront vulnerability. Maya, the woman who had long shielded herself with independence, would learn that compassion could be transformative. And in that quiet corner of the restaurant before the sun had fully risen, the stage was set for a meeting neither expected, but both would remember forever. If you're already feeling the tension and emotional pull between Alexander and Maya, hit like, comment your first impressions, and subscribe to follow their journey. You won't want to miss what happens next.
The early morning sun had barely climbed above the skyline when Alexander Hale leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. The documents lay before him like a battlefield he had been marching across for decades. Each number, a silent verdict on his life. Bankruptcy. The word tasted like ash on his tongue, bitter and final. And then Maya's voice, a gentle ripple in the tense air, had stopped him. "I think there's a miscalculation here," she had said. Her finger hovered over the line where a missing zero could cost him everything. He had looked at her then, at the young waitress with the sharp eyes that seemed to pierce the protective armor he wore so religiously, and felt an unfamiliar sensation. Hope. Hope, Alexander realized, was dangerous. He swallowed the rising panic in his chest and leaned forward. "Show me," he said, his voice quieter than before, almost vulnerable. Maya hesitated, aware that she was crossing a boundary most people of his status would have demanded, but the instinct to act, to correct the injustice of a simple oversight, overpowered caution. "Here," she said softly, "this note. Your payment schedule is missing a zero. If signed like this, the court could reject your challenge, and it could be final." Alexander's hand trembled slightly as he took the paper, eyes narrowing as he scanned the numbers. The silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. It was the first time in years he had felt anyone's gaze resting on him, not with judgment, not with fear, not with expectation, but with clear intention. You saved me," he said finally, almost disbelieving, though his pride bristled at the admission. "I didn't do it to save you," Maya replied firmly, though her lips quirked into the smallest smile. "I did it because someone had to notice. Someone has to care enough to act. That's all." The truth of her words hit harder than he expected. Alexander had spent decades surrounded by people who nodded and agreed, who smiled politely but never actually saw him. And here was someone who not only saw him, but acted, quietly, without expectation. It stirred something long buried inside him, a yearning he had buried beneath spreadsheets, contracts, and the steel of control. "You don't understand what this means," he murmured. "If I sign this incorrectly," his voice faltered, almost cracking. He wasn't used to admitting fear, not to anyone, not to himself, and yet he felt the need to confide in her, to share that invisible weight he carried. Maya placed a reassuring hand lightly on the table, her touch tentative, careful. "I do understand," she said, her voice calm. "I've been in situations where a small mistake changes everything. You think it's the end, but sometimes noticing the tiny detail is what turns the tide." Alexander's eyes met hers, and for the first time he allowed himself a breath of vulnerability. He wanted to ask her name, to know her story, but pride and instinct held him back. Still, the warmth of her presence settled around him, soft and gentle, like sunlight filtering through blinds into a room long left cold. The moment hung, fragile and fleeting. Around them, the restaurant moved in quiet rhythm, the clinking of silverware, the soft hum of the piano, the rustle of servers' footsteps. Outside, the city carried on, unaware that a life-altering decision had just been delayed by the quiet courage of a young woman. Alexander cleared his throat, masking the trembling in his hands. How did you notice that?" he asked, not accusing, not curious, but genuinely seeking the answer. Maya shrugged, keeping her gaze steady. "I pay attention," she said simply. "I notice patterns, mistakes, things most people overlook. It's a skill I've had to develop to survive." Her honesty, unadorned and sincere, struck him with an almost painful clarity. Alexander realized that while he had wealth, power, and influence, he had lost touch with the simple truth that observation, care, and attentiveness, human connection itself, could save as much as any bank account. I don't know how to thank you," he said, voice low, almost vulnerable. Alexander Hale, billionaire, man of precision, perfection, and pride, had never felt words stumble out of his mouth this way. It was unsettling, yes, but oddly comforting. "You don't need to thank me," Maya said, her gaze softening. "Just don't forget that people matter more than numbers sometimes. That's all I ask." Alexander's chest tightened, a mixture of awe, gratitude, and an unfamiliar tenderness he refused to name. He wanted to argue, to dismiss it, to retreat behind his usual walls, but he couldn't, not this time. The encounter left them both shaken, though for different reasons. Maya felt the strange flutter of connection, tinged with caution. He was intimidating, yes, and proud beyond measure, but there was a human heart buried somewhere beneath the armor. And Alexander felt the weight of gratitude and the stirrings of something more complex than relief, something dangerously close to trust, and even, perhaps, admiration. But they neither acted on it immediately. There was too much at stake, too much pride, too much history of guarding their vulnerabilities. The documents still lay in front of him, and the clock was ticking toward an unforgiving deadline. Yet the spark had been lit, quietly, in a corner booth bathed in morning light, a spark that neither could ignore. Alexander's world, built on precision and control, had collided with Maya's, built on resilience and careful observation. The collision sent tiny shockwaves through both their lives, altering the trajectory of an otherwise ordinary day. The morning wore on, and with every small task, Maya refilling his coffee, Alexander scanning the documents again, the tension between them grew. Not the fiery, explosive kind, but a quiet, charged anticipation, the kind that thrives in unspoken acknowledgement of mutual significance. And as Alexander finally pushed back from the table, a weight lifted slightly from his shoulders, though the storm of potential bankruptcy still loomed. He glanced at Maya, offering the faintest nod of respect, and for a moment, the world shrunk to just the two of them. Maya, her heart fluttering despite herself, felt the same quiet acknowledgement. Something fragile, something rare had begun. And although neither fully understood it yet, both sensed that life as they knew it had shifted irreversibly. In the quiet of the restaurant, between the hum of early morning preparation and the faint notes of the piano, the first threads of trust, hope, and connection were stitched, delicately, carefully, impossibly.
The days after that morning in the corner booth passed like a slow, persistent tide. Alexander Hale returned to his office, buried under stacks of paperwork, conference calls, and the relentless hum of corporate machinery. The mistake Maya had spotted saved him from immediate disaster, but it didn't erase the mounting pressure from creditors, board members, and the gnawing anxiety that had taken root over the past months. Yet, no matter how deeply he tried to bury it, her words and presence lingered at the edges of his mind like a stubborn shadow. He tried to convince himself it was absurd. A waitress, brilliant, yes, perceptive, yes, but still a waitress. She was outside his world, and he didn't have time for distractions. He focused on spreadsheets, projections, and meetings, forcing the memory of her steady eyes and soft, firm voice into a box labeled irrelevant. Pride demanded it. Habit demanded it. Maya, meanwhile, returned to her routine with a mix of satisfaction and unease. She had done the right thing, and yet she found herself replaying the encounter in her mind more often than she would admit. He was frustrating, guarded, infuriating, and yet, in some quiet, inexplicable way, he had touched something in her that had been long dormant. She told herself it was nothing. He was rich, complicated, probably inaccessible, and she was, well, exactly who she had always been, cautious, observant, surviving. But still, she noticed the subtle signs of him watching from across the room, lingering a moment longer when their paths crossed. Weeks passed, and the tension between them thickened without acknowledgement. Alexander, ever proud, refused to seek out Maya, yet found himself unsettled when she wasn't nearby. Maya, ever cautious, avoided lingering too long at his table, yet couldn't ignore the magnetic pull that seemed to draw her attention toward him despite her best efforts. Then came the day that forced them into confrontation. Alabaster Row had prepared a private meeting room for Alexander's urgent session with his lawyers. Papers, contracts, and a tense urgency filled the space. The restaurant's manager had insisted Maya attend, not as a waitress, but as someone who had already demonstrated knowledge and attention to critical details. Alexander's eyes met hers when she entered, a flicker of surprise and something softer passing through them. "I didn't request you," Alexander said curtly, the hint of tension in his voice betraying his nerves. "I can handle this." "I know," Maya said, her tone even, "but they asked for me. I didn't come to overstep. I came because I noticed things before, and I want to help." Alexander turned away, leaning against the edge of the table, running a hand through his hair. He hated how vulnerable he felt in her presence, how her quiet confidence unsettled him. He didn't know how to fight against honesty that wasn't rooted in malice. "This isn't personal," he said. "It's business. I don't need help from anyone outside this room." "Yet you've been ignoring details your staff missed, and you almost signed something irreversible." Her eyes softened, no trace of condescension, only honesty. "I can help you avoid that again." He sighed,
tension rolling off him in waves, and for a moment he allowed himself the smallest concession that she might be right. But pride, that relentless, suffocating pride, pushed him back. "I've managed every crisis of my life myself," he said, voice tight. I'm not letting anyone in now." Maya paused, studying him. She understood resistance. She had practiced it herself for years, walls built so high that even kindness sometimes bounced off harmlessly. But she also understood that sometimes persistence mattered more than pride. "You're not alone in this," she said softly. "Even the strongest people need someone to notice when the cracks are too small to see on their own." He closed his eyes briefly, leaning back in his chair, and felt the weight of every expectation, every past failure, every isolationist decision pressing down. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to imagine trusting her, leaning on her insight without fear of judgment or ridicule, and it terrified him. The day continued, the lawyers pressing for clarity, the numbers demanding answers, yet through it all, Maya remained steady, patient, observant. She offered insight where he faltered, guidance where he hesitated, and a calm presence that felt, unsettlingly, like safety. Alexander fought it, waged silent war with himself against gratitude, against the pull of human connection he hadn't felt in years. Finally, the meeting broke. Alexander stood, stiff, his face a mask of authority hiding inner turbulence. Maya followed, her own emotions tightly restrained. Their eyes met in a silent acknowledgement. Something had shifted, though neither would name it aloud. Outside the meeting room, the world continued its relentless pace, but inside the bubble of their shared tension, both felt the stirring of change. The pride that kept them apart also bound them together, a taut thread that neither wanted to sever nor fully embrace. That evening, Alexander walked alone through the city streets, the weight of decisions pressing against him. He replayed every interaction with Maya in his mind, each word, each glance. He hated the vulnerability it brought, the reminder that control was never absolute. And yet, he couldn't shake the thought that without her insight, without her honesty, he might have lost everything. Meanwhile, Maya closed the restaurant, the smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air, the chairs stacked neatly on tables, the quiet of the night settling around her. She thought of him, his pride, the way he carried himself like the world depended on his composure, and she felt a pang of empathy, tinged with frustration. He was so capable, yet so human in his fears. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance, but she held back. It wasn't her place, yet. And so the tension persisted, a quiet, electric force. They avoided, misinterpreted, and denied their feelings. Every glance lingered too long, every word carried weight, yet neither acted. Circumstances, however, were slowly conspiring to push them back together. Meetings, emergencies, and small crises ensured that their paths would cross again, whether they liked it or not. Because some collisions, once sparked, refuse to be ignored. What do you think? Comment below on how you think their walls might start to crumble, and hit like if you're ready to follow their journey to the next emotional chapter.
The storm hit without warning. A sudden surge of media attention, rumors of Alexander Hale's financial collapse forced him to retreat from the public eye. Meetings were canceled, investors demanded explanations, and the press circled like vultures sensing weakness. Alexander had no choice but to spend hours holed up in the restaurant's private quarters with his legal team and, reluctantly, Maya, who had become indispensable in reviewing every financial document. The initial moments were awkward, stiff. Alexander, accustomed to commanding space and control, found himself sharing a room with someone whose world he had once considered distant and inconsequential. Maya, usually the observer, now became an active participant in decisions that could alter fortunes. Their proximity forced acknowledgement. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not.
"Do you always insist on doing everything yourself?" Maya asked gently during a lull, glancing at the chart spread across the mahogany table. Alexander stiffened. "I've managed my life this way for decades. It works," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. He didn't meet her gaze, instead scanning the documents as if pretending focus could armor him against the vulnerability her presence provoked. "I can see that," Maya said, soft but unwavering. "But sometimes even the strongest need a hand, or someone to notice the small cracks before they become disasters." His chest tightened. She had said the same thing weeks ago, and yet hearing it now, while the pressure of a collapsing empire pressed against him, it landed differently. He wanted to argue. He wanted to retreat behind his usual walls, but the fatigue in his body, the mounting tension of endless scrutiny, and the quiet persistence in her eyes kept him silent. The hours passed in this delicate dance. Maya guided him through financial projections, corrected overlooked mistakes, and anticipated complications with a precision that astonished him. Alexander found himself listening, not just with attention, but with respect. Every small correction she made eased a fraction of the weight he carried, and for the first time in a long time, he realized that relying on someone did not necessarily mean weakness. "You make it sound so simple," he muttered at one point, brushing a hand across his forehead. "It only seems simple because I see patterns you might overlook when you're too close to the numbers," she replied. Her tone was kind, almost nurturing, but never patronizing. It was disarming. For a moment, the air between them softened, a fragile bond forming through shared struggle. Alexander dared a glance at her, noticing the subtle weariness in her eyes, the quiet resilience etched into every movement. He recognized her courage, her unwavering attention, and her quiet insistence on doing what was right, even when it was inconvenient or dangerous. "You're extraordinary," he said suddenly, almost a whisper. The words startled him. They were uncharacteristic, honest, and vulnerable. He looked away immediately, fighting the urge to retreat back into his walls. Maya blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Then, quietly, she said, "You're not so bad yourself. For someone who insists on control, you're learning to trust." The unspoken acknowledgement hung between them, a tender weight neither wanted to fully name. Alexander wanted to reach across the table, to offer a hand or a word of thanks that could not be fully expressed in spreadsheets and documents, but the pride that had defined him for decades remained a subtle barrier, keeping the connection delicate, fragile, and unclaimed. They spent the next hours moving in a rhythm neither expected. Alexander would identify a potential error, Maya would catch it before it became a catastrophe. When the tension threatened to boil over, Maya's calm presence anchored him. When fatigue and doubt crept in, Alexander's focus and determination reminded her that she was not alone in this fight. By late afternoon, exhaustion settled over them, but it carried a strange comfort. The crisis had forced a closeness neither could have orchestrated on their own. In the shared silence between reviewing projections and legal clauses, they glimpsed each other's humanity, flaws, strengths, fears, and courage, and something tender began to take root. Alexander finally looked at her directly, truly seeing her. "You've done more than just notice mistakes," he admitted softly. "You made a difference, not just for the numbers, but for me." Maya's chest tightened. Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes that's all people need," she said, "to know someone notices, to know someone cares enough to act." The tension softened, not vanished. There was still pride, still fear, still the looming threat of collapse outside the walls of their temporary sanctuary. But the fragility of their bond had been established, stitched together with moments of patience, kindness, and unspoken understanding.
As evening fell, the city outside darkening into a tapestry of lights, Alexander leaned back in his chair, allowing a rare moment of reflection. Maya, tired but unwavering, observed him with quiet warmth. Their differences, the worlds they came from, the pride and defiance each carried, had not disappeared, but they had begun to melt ever so slightly under the heat of shared struggle and empathy. For the first time, Alexander acknowledged a quiet truth he had avoided for years. He was not invincible. He could fail. He could falter. And yet, with someone like Maya, he might just survive, not just the collapse of his empire, but the collapse of the walls around his heart. And for Maya, the truth was equally profound. She had learned to survive, to shield herself from disappointment and heartbreak. Yet in Alexander's presence, she discovered the possibility of connection, the fragile hope that kindness could bridge worlds, and that even prideful hearts could open when met with patience and respect. But as they parted that evening, Alexander returning to the shadows of his office, Maya to the quiet hum of the restaurant, they both knew that the fragility of their bond carried a warning. Walls could crumble, trust could grow, but heartbreak still lingered on the horizon. Their closeness had created intimacy, but intimacy was a risk, and the next challenge could either deepen their connection or shatter it entirely. The collision had begun in a quiet, sunlit corner. The spark had flared in the corner booth. Now, in forced proximity, the fire had begun to burn, fragile and beautiful, illuminating vulnerabilities neither expected to share. If you liked this story, comment which moment of their forced proximity moved you most, and subscribe to see whether their fragile trust will survive the next test.
The city had grown restless by the time Alexander Hale stepped into the boardroom, the last remaining documents heavy in his briefcase. Rumors of his financial collapse had spread like wildfire. Investors, reporters, and lawyers circled him, their eyes sharp, expectant, unforgiving. For a man who had prided himself on control, the walls were closing in faster than he could anticipate. And yet, despite the storm outside, one person remained a constant anchor, Maya. She had stayed by his side through every late-night review, every tense phone call, every legal obstacle. Her quiet presence had become indispensable, not just to the survival of his business, but to the survival of his confidence, his sense of hope, and, unexpectedly, his heart. The final crisis came in the form of a miscommunication, a clause misread by one of the junior attorneys. If signed as it stood, Alexander would be forced into liquidation. It was the same kind of disaster he had narrowly avoided weeks before, only now magnified by public scrutiny. The room fell silent as he held the papers, the weight of consequence pressing down like a vice. Maya stepped forward, eyes steady. "Alexander," she said softly, "you don't have to do this alone. Let me help." For a moment he felt the old reflex, pride, stubbornness, the belief that vulnerability equaled weakness. But looking at her, at the calm strength, the unwavering kindness, the sharp mind that had guided him through his worst hours, he realized that he had been wrong for years. Vulnerability wasn't defeat, it was human, it was connection. "Thank you," he said, voice low, almost breaking. I need you." Maya smiled gently, a light in the midst of chaos. "I'm here." They moved together, reviewing the document, tracing every line, every clause, every number. Alexander noticed the subtle way she pointed out the risks without criticism, the way she balanced logic with empathy. He was acutely aware of her presence, the brush of her hand against his as they shifted papers, the warmth of her shoulder when she leaned closer to explain a subtle detail. Hours passed, the storm outside mirrored by the tension in the room. And then, finally, the documents were corrected, the crisis was averted. Alexander exhaled, a rare, genuine release of breath, and looked at Maya with gratitude deeper than words could express.
"You've saved me," he said, again, though this time it felt different, not simply acknowledging her skill, but recognizing the profound impact she had on his life, his perspective, his heart. Maya shook her head, eyes soft. "No, we saved this together." For a moment, the room faded away, the lawyers, the board members, the city's expectation, and all that remained was the fragile, newly formed bond between two people who had collided against fate and circumstance, slowly dismantling their walls to reveal hearts they had long hidden. But just as relief settled in, a misunderstanding struck. A reporter's camera had caught a moment between them, misconstrued it, and the story went viral. Headlines painted Maya as an insider leveraging her influence to sway a billionaire, a narrative that threatened to tarnish her reputation and undo the trust they had carefully built. Alexander felt a surge of protective rage, but he also recognized the fragility of their connection. She needed his support, but she also needed space to assert herself. Maya, reading the headlines on her phone, felt a wave of anger and vulnerability. She had risked so much, opened herself up, only to be misrepresented. Her first instinct was to retreat, to pull back from the man whose presence had begun to mean more than she had expected. And yet, in the quiet of the office, she sensed Alexander watching, waiting, unsure how to bridge the growing chasm. He approached her, careful, deliberate. "Maya," he said, voice gentle but firm, "don't leave. Don't let them define what we've built here. You—" He stopped, searching for words, vulnerable in a way he rarely allowed. "You mean more than all of this, more than the company, more than pride, more than everything I thought I had to protect." Her eyes filled with emotion, gratitude, fear, relief, and an unspoken longing. "I don't want to be part of a story they'll twist," she whispered. Alexander took her hands, steadying her in the quiet storm. "Then we write our own story," he said simply. "Together, no one else's words matter, only ours." The vulnerability between them broke the last remnants of resistance. Maya leaned slightly into him, a gesture of trust she had withheld for so long. Alexander, careful not to overstep, mirrored her movement, allowing the closeness to exist without pressure, without expectation, just acknowledgement of what had grown between them. The world outside continued to spin, but inside that office, in the quiet aftermath of crisis and revelation, Alexander and Maya faced the profound truth: connection, honesty, and kindness could survive even the most challenging storms. He smiled, an expression rare in its softness. "I don't know how to thank you for everything," he said, voice husky with emotion. "You don't need to," Maya replied, her lips curving gently. "Just keep noticing. Keep being human. That's all I ask." Alexander's gaze softened, and he nodded. "I'll do more than notice. I'll cherish it. Cherish you." In that moment, the tension of weeks, the fear, the pride, the potential collapse, dissolved into quiet relief and shared understanding. They had survived financial ruin, public scrutiny, and personal vulnerability, and through it all, they had discovered something far more valuable: trust, kindness, and the courage to love gently, without pretense. Outside, the sun set over the city skyline, painting the horizon in warm golds and deep purples. Inside, two hearts beat in quiet sync, fragile but steady, and neither would ever be the same. Alexander Hale and Maya Santos had collided, resisted, and finally embraced the force of connection, one that no misunderstanding, no crisis, and no pride could undo. They had come to the edge of despair and found something extraordinary. Love, trust, and kindness had not only saved Alexander's empire, they had saved them both. And as they stood side by side, no words were needed to acknowledge the depth of what had blossomed between them. It was quiet, tender, real, and unbreakable. If Alexander and Maya's journey tugged at your heart, hit like, comment your favorite moment of their story, and subscribe to see more emotional, heartfelt romances unfold.